Everyone, we're back with Jackson talking about the seriousness or the what are we calling this again? What's the title of our thing this past 2 weeks? The serious side of
Serious
no,
Business of
the
Happiness for
serious business.
SMBs, part two.
Yes, cool. Part two, yes. So I'm excited to get a little bit more in the weeds on some ways to effectively uh, be a little happier as a business owner. And we talked a bit more high level last week about what it looks like to remove some stress from your life as a business owner, what that work life sort of quote unquote balance looks like. And again, today we're going to get a little bit deeper on some strategies and takeaways, and how to implement some of the things we talked about last week into your life. So I'll uh, I'll jump over to Jackson to kind of reintroduce himself really quick, just like a 1 minute spiel about what you're working on and what you're doing, and then we can uh, we can jump into it.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So, last week we really made the business case for why happiness is serious business. Everything from your cognitive performance to your physical health to sales to even the stock prices of companies that have happier employees. And so that's really a lot of the work I do now as I'm a speaker, author, coach, consultant, working with many organizations from military, first responders to nonprofits, but I kind of have a bit of a niche as well, serving small to mid-sized businesses with employee engagement, performance type questions.
Love it. Yeah, this is so applicable for anybody in the like sub. I mean, you've worked with some pretty large companies, so it's definitely not only like sub 5 million in revenue businesses where these like owners are very operational, very in the weeds. Like, there's no time management involved. It's just like putting fires out consistently, and so this is super applicable for them. But like we talked about last week, you've worked with some pretty large companies and just general uh, like time management skills and leadership skills and development and things that have really, really improved not only their culture but their bottom line. So excited to hear some of the strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, why don't we start there? We'll focus on a bit more of the strategy and maybe what we could think of as leadership development. And then if you want to hear a bit more of the stuff I do around like the perfect week and the sometimes personal operating systems, what I call it, around time management, we can touch on that too. Um,
Love it.
but yeah, I thought I'd start with Google. So Google, right? We all know Google, right? And they're one of the top performing companies out there, really elite in terms of their talent, their leadership development, their programs, their investing in their workforce. And this was probably about 15 years ago, I think it was. They tried to figure out what actually makes for the highest performing teams. Like, can we study this? And they decided to call it Project Aristotle. Now, the reason they did that is kind of interesting because Aristotle had a quote that was something to the effect of the whole is more than the sum of its parts, or the whole is something other than the sum of its parts. And so they wanted to understand, well, if you have 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, you have 5 ones. When you actually look at how the team operates, sometimes it doesn't add up to 5. Sometimes it sucks and it's like a 2. Sometimes it is exponential, and it's like a 10. So what are the sort of factors that drive team performance? And they narrowed it down to like the top 3 things. So they had 150 different teams. They had executive level evaluation, middle manager evaluation, team member evaluation. So you're sort of getting all those perspectives. They also looked at how well the teams performed versus their projections. And it was kind of surprising. It wasn't about who was on the team. It wasn't about their technical expertise. It wasn't about where they went to school and how many Ivy League degrees were on the team. They all really came down to their ways of working. And I think they clustered around really 2 things. So let's look at the third most important factor and the second most important factor. Those were clarity and dependability. So essentially, people understand the standards, the expectations, what is expected of them in their role. So there's that clarity and structure. And then there's the dependability, which is people are accountable, people are taking ownership, people are bought in, people are committed to those standards. Okay, so that's kind of intuitive. We can see why that's important. But the number one most important factor, something called psychological safety, which means that you feel an environment is safe for what's called interpersonal risk taking. So that means I can ask a question and be like, Sean, I don't really understand what we're doing with this project. I can challenge the status quo. You say, Devin, I think that this system we have here doesn't make a lot of sense. And so when you have that ability to take what's called an interpersonal risk, to speak up, to ask a question, to try something new, to try to improve something without the fear of, well, if you fail, people are going to be like, oh, you're stupid, or we're going to kick you out. Right? That environment of trust, where you have enough genuine trust and connection to create vulnerability, that was the number one highest performing factor. So we're starting to get a working model here that I'll show you how they come together, where we know that it's important that you have these clear standards and expectations with accountability and buy-in to those standards. But we also know on the same time, you need to have some genuine trust and connection enough to create that psychological safety. And so with that as a start point, I'm going to talk you through a story of how we brought this into a relatively small business. And this applies, by the way, even if you have just a team of maybe 5 people, or if you're a solopreneur that has contractors or collaborators, okay? Same thing, it applies. And as you scale, you're going to want to have these in your mind. So these 2 sets of factors, both of which also predict really happiness at work, as you can imagine. If you're very clear with what your role is and you feel bought into it and you feel like there's a shared standard, but you also feel trust and connection with your people around you, like you're probably enjoying your role, right? So it's, again, that happiness and performance connection. But I'm going to show you how these come together. So this is based on the work of Dr. Amy Edmondson, who's a professor at Harvard Business School. So remember, the first thing I just said was that clarity and dependability. So we have these shared values, standards, expectations, and we're taking ownership. We're being held accountable. We are committed to them. So you can think of placing that on one axis down here. Call it buy-in and accountability. And then remember, the other set of factor was that connection and trust, what we may call psychological safety up here. So now you can imagine first, if you have a ton of like trust and connection and we're all friends here, but you have not a lot of that buy-in or accountability to the shared values, that's going to kind of put you up here. This is the comfort zone, right? Where you're not really getting results. You don't really have that high performance culture. It's kind of just like, oh, hey, we're all friends here. But in this, especially as a driven entrepreneur, small business owner, key executive, you need to be careful of the other side. If you don't have that trust and connection, but you just have the high standards, the accountability, you're driven, you're bought in, a lot of time that's where you get burnout or a toxic culture, or even worse, sometimes you develop a culture where people are really doing 2 jobs. Okay, the job that they're paid to do, and then the job of covering their ass and making sure that they look good to everyone else. And then finally you have, well, I don't even know if I need to explain it, because if you're lacking psychological safety and you don't have shared values with standards and accountability and buy-in to them, you're down here, which is just, lousy. I don't even know how you run a business that way. Maybe like Congress, would be a good example of that, right? They all hate each other. They don't trust one another, and they don't really care about getting results or getting things done. And so you see how well that goes. But finally, when you get both of those things, right? This is what we saw at Google. You get what's called the learning zone, which is the zone of optimal performance. Why? Because again, you have that clarity, that dependability, the buy-in to those shared values and your standards of doing things, but you also have enough trust and connection so that you feel you can fail, you can speak up, you can challenge the status quo and iteratively improve your ways of working and effectively communicate. Okay, so that's really like, I can sum up the whole culture change book. You could go read 3 Simon Sinek books, or you could just remember this visual graphic right here. Now, I want to make sure this is not too abstract. I'll tell you how we did some of these things at this small to mid-sized trucking company. They came to us about 2-3 years ago, and they were really struggling with their operations and safety. And so particularly, we saw a lot of issues coming out with cost of claims, with accidents, with incidents. And we really started to see that it was mostly a cultural deficit more than their safety program on paper. So we started, okay, let's say first, we're going to try to get that psychological safety right. And we saw that they had a lot of issues with that. There was gaps between staff and management, feeling like they couldn't really talk to one another. There's sometimes some toxic leaders, and a lot of this culture, you can imagine, right? These are truck drivers. So, a truck driver who's a really good truck driver or really good at fixing trucks, okay, and they've been trained on that, so they know how to do that. All of a sudden, they're in charge of leading the people who are working on the trucks, and no one really taught them how to do that, right? And this is common again in so many small businesses. You develop someone, you train them to be a technician, but all of a sudden you get a big new client and you have 3 more employees under them. And it's like, well, you're no longer in charge of doing the work really well. You're in charge of helping others to do the work really well. So we train their drivers really on the basics of how do you effectively build trust and rapport and emotional connection so that you can influence people. So, instead of like, hey, what are you doing here? Well, you're 15 minutes late to work today. How many times do I have to tell you, if that happens again, your ass is out of here? The knife hand. You can still have that standard of accountability, but think of the conversation instead. If you were to come in and say, hey, I think this is the second time you've been late this month. Is everything okay? Like, what's going on at home? Is there anything we could do? Could we play with your shift schedule to have you start 15 minutes later? And if this pattern continues, like, what can we do to mitigate this? And what do you think the consequences should look like? Right. So again, it's just a slightly different frame, but engaging in a way that has much more emotional intelligence. And the second thing we did was we organized these kind of company town halls, which, a lot of times would only be 20 members of management, from kind of that frontline supervisor level to the CEO of the company, where we could openly discuss what are the conflicts or the challenges, particularly between like management and staff, what's not going well, but also what are the stories of things that are going well. What needs to change? What's not working? What are we not sure of? All of those conversations that often are difficult to have, especially if you have like a frontline person and the owner of the business. We kind of created a container where we could openly and safely discuss some of those topics and have those difficult conversations. Okay. So right there, right? We've just created that psychological safety. But we also need to think about creating that buy-in around these shared values of safety excellence. So, we redid the company mission statement, the vision statement. Leadership had an intense focus on this shared value, this standard, holding people accountable to it. And a couple of things we did there, we had all of the drivers even sign off on letters to their family stating their commitment to safety. Well, why? Because it's not, hey, dude, whenever you wreck your truck, it costs us a shitload of money. So can you please stop doing that? No, you care about safety because you want to get home to your family each and every day. They're the people you work for. They're why you do it. They're what matters to you. So again, we're connecting to that sort of the why, the clarity, the dependability, right? That shared standard, we're making it about them to improve their buy-in. And then I think in like the very first day of this engagement, my business partner, Paul, he showed up at the board meeting in a police outfit, and he pretended to arrest the COO for reckless endangerment and manslaughter. and then proceeded to tell the executive team that if they didn't immediately improve their safety performance, their insurer was going to drop them and they would dissolve the company and they'd be legally unable to operate, which was all true, by the way, because their safety program was in a bad place. So all of a sudden, a bit more buy-in and accountability there, right? From the top of the organization down. So you put those two things together, all of a sudden we're shifting the whole culture of that small business more towards the learning zone, where people, with respect to safety especially, they have shared values and standards that they're held accountable to and they're bought into it. But we also have the trust and connection with effective communication. As we move them into that zone, what we saw was an 80% reduction in cost of claims over about a year, $3 million savings, their best year for profitability in the last 10 years. So the final thing I'll say with this is we see at that story that culture change and the sort of psychological dimension of the workforce is serious business. And so if you're thinking about coming out of this session with a little checklist, I would encourage you to start with number one is just assessment. So you can do this quantitative or qualitative. How are you doing in terms of trust on your team? Do people feel they can speak up? As an owner, how often are you challenged on your perspective or your ways of doing things? And then don't forget the other side. Do we have shared values and are we holding people accountable to those behaviors? How? What are our accountability systems when we look at our talent management processes, when we look at our management org chart and approvals? Okay, so you can start there once you do the assessment. And then you start to think about, well, have we trained our leaders to be not just technicians, but leading other technicians? Have we trained them on the intangibles? Have we kind of articulated all of our do's and our don'ts in a transparent way so that we know what the clarity is and then people can take ownership of those behaviors? Are we trying to provide some opportunities as well just for genuine connection? People having those friendships at work is necessary oftentimes to then have those difficult conversations that require psychological safety. And then any culture change you're trying to make, any way of working, any shared value or behavior you're trying to change, you need some mechanism to sustain the focus. Just like we had those weekly town hall type meetings, whether it's a weekly check-in, a monthly check-in, as an executive team especially, you need to sustain that focus over the long term to make the changes stick. So hope that gives you a start place, a little working model and some ideas, whether you're a small team right now, or again, as you're scaling to those first few employees, this is really going to help you along the way.
Dude, great job. That was really, really good. Before I forget, do you mind taking a picture of that little graph that you just drew?
Of course.
I'd
Yeah,
love
good
to
idea
attach
on that.
in the comment section, because
Yeah.
that's a really, really good visual. One thing that came to mind towards the latter part of that was, like, take somebody who is sort of in the middle, like they have good relationships with the team. Let's say everyone's somewhat friendly, right? They're coworkers, but maybe a couple of them spend time out of work together. They go to the bar, whatever it is. And then you have the other part of the team who's like strictly there for work. So you have a pretty large team, and you're in the middle. Again, half of them love it, half of them are just there for the job, and you are up to this point struggling to build like really good relationships as a leader with the team.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, without bringing in like an external consultant to like sit everyone down and like and say like, all right, here's what Sean's struggling with, like listen to him. How do you like reintroduce or like revitalize the culture if things are struggling up to this point? Like, do you do a town hall? Do you just get everyone together and you're like, hey, I haven't been doing this very well. I want to flip the script. I want to have a different approach with you guys. Like, what are some ways to like reintroduce yourself if you've been working on yourself as a leader, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, I think that humility as a leader that you sort of voice there can be really powerful, especially because oftentimes people are kind of like role modeling how the executive or the CEO or the owner is conducting themselves as sort of their model of what is the dynamic that we're going to have here. I remember when I first took a job in corporate, I was at a company that it wasn't a horrible toxic culture by any means, but it was like very buttoned up, like you could tell like people were just like, hey, what's up? Okay, nice to meet you. Like, okay, like you didn't really. And it started because I saw how the directors carried themselves and the VPs and then the managers. And so just starting with the frame you suggest, I think as an owner is a great way to do it, of like, hey, here's what I'm working on and I want to get better at this, right? Like voicing that it's a work in progress. My start place might be just articulating what those shared values might be for your team or your company or your group. And maybe even taking it a step further of like, okay, well, like what are the behaviors associated with that, right? Or sometimes a question I always ask when I'm facilitating that can be powerful is like, 3 months from now or 12 months from now, like how would we know if we were successful in some of these cultural or psychological type strategies? So I think once you have some, and that's a good way to get the input from other people and try to like coalesce into something more around, okay, well, like this is kind of our contract, like our social contract as a group for how we're going to work together. And then I think from there, that's where you can shift gears a little bit into maybe the one-on-one coaching development and really like empathy focused sessions, maybe if people are struggling with that, right? So if someone's not a fit in terms of what you're looking for there, maybe you can just say like, hey, my perception is whatever, this is a gap I'm seeing. Like, what could I do, or what could maybe even we do to help you do this or achieve this or change this, right? And all of a sudden it's kind of bringing them in and from a place of empathy.
Yeah, to your point, it's never like, hey, you're really bad at this. It's more like, hey, what am I doing wrong? That's like, are you not trained enough? Do you not understand how to do the job? Have I not communicated well enough? Like, there's so many other ways to approach it versus like, hey, you suck.
Yeah.
You're not doing a good job. Right. Yeah. So cool. Love that. Devin, anything come to mind after Jackson's
I was just thinking about because I know you were mentioning for like small business stuff. I had the privilege of working with a really high-powered team years ago. It was a smaller company. They were sort of taking some of the hints from other places that had like ping pong tables, and they would serve like beer for the staff and like all kinds of fun stuff. And I'm wondering, like, as far as leadership qualities and leadership things that you've seen with like smaller businesses, for those of us who have like little offices and teams of like even sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5, or 10 people, how those kinds of qualities you're talking about, how could we apply some of that to like a smaller organization?
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the simplest things you could do is just have some intentional. I say like you want to be careful, right? Always with like forced fun. And I feel like that becomes harder to manage as you scale a company. Like if you're at one of these huge companies and they try to do a networking event, it's always like the most cringe, I feel like. So in a way, in a smaller team, I feel like you have an advantage. But just I'd say number one could be an intentional time of like, okay, hey, yeah, we're literally going to spend an hour and go do an escape room, or like we're going to go through, you can look up this set of questions. I think it's called the 36 questions for friendship. And we're going to do a subset of 5 of them. Or we're going to sit down and do somewhat of an intentional icebreaker. Or we're even going to set aside time and do like a mini job crafting session where like, if we were a team, the 3 of us, it'd be like, okay, well, each of us can sort of vent to one another off the record, so to speak, of like what we don't like with our role and maybe how we could reshape our role within reason to do more of the things we want to do. Okay, whatever. Any of those things are going to kind of create a bit more intentional connection, vulnerability. I think, as opposed to just being like, all right, well, we'll just hang out and grab a beer for 30 minutes or whatever. Okay. So you're trying to create that first one, that psychological safety and connection. So I think you can just be intentional with a bit of development time, just like you would for developing other things there. And then on the shared standards kind of buy-in side for a small team, I think, again, just making sure you're transparent and clear in whatever both your quantitative and your qualitative observables. So if we're saying, all right, Devin, for your role, we're going to partner on this probably, by the way, but like, here's what I think we should look at as your quantifiable metrics for success. And then qualitatively, well, in terms of, maybe our culture or your way of working, like, what are some of the behaviors or things we want to see here? And then once you're very clear and transparent there with that small team, I think same thing. You can just reference back to that if you see people not meeting the standard, similar to how Sean said, where it's not so much like, oh, I'm accusing you, Devin, of not doing your job or something. It's more like, hey, this is what I'm seeing as a gap from what we previously agreed on. This was our sort of standard going on here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
What do you think about one-on-ones? I know that's a very basic question, but I've heard that, like, two sides of the coin. I've heard, some people, even the guy who runs NVIDIA is like, I never do one-on-ones. I don't care what's going on. Like, I'll never sit down one-on-one with a team member. So I found that really interesting, because you have like a Gary Vee who's like, I sit down with every single person that's ever hired in my company for at least 15 minutes. Right. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. Like, from the companies you've seen and worked with, is there a pro or a con to just like team meeting versus one-on-one, or doing both consistently?
Yeah, I'm more, I guess, my environment, I haven't worked as much in larger companies, so I'll borrow more from a bit, I guess, of like the research and literature I've seen on this. But yeah, I think Chet Holmes, he's some good stuff on this, but he talks about having, like, you should have, I think he has some number, but it's like this idea of like, you should have no more than 10 direct reports at any time. And so I think it really comes down to making sure you have that right ratio, and then you actually have the time to do that targeted development for each one. So I actually do have a bit of a better case study for this. It is from the military, but it'll translate to business. The Wisconsin Army National Guard Recruiting and Retention Battalion, which is really like, National Guard's a 7,000 person organization, Wisconsin one. They're basically like the sales function of the National Guard, right? Because they're getting enlistments, they're getting people into the organization. They did something where they looked at the basically manager to recruiter ratios for all these different states across the country, and found a perfect correlation where if you had too many people reporting to one manager, you didn't get results. And then there were a couple states that improved that ratio, and their numbers went up every year. So they restructured things a little bit, and they dropped their ratio from something like, it was like 12-1 to like 6-1 or something like that. And they ended up with a 34% turnaround in recruiting production. They also exceeded all their other state missions for the first time in 6 years. And so we had done other culture-focused stuff with them that contributed to that. But I think what this takes me back to with your question, Sean, is I don't know that it's so much like, do you have a one-on-one every week, or do you have one every 2 weeks, or is it just a group thing? The real nugget there is, whatever your cadence is, you should be doing individual targeted development time with each person on your team. And I think if you have so many people on your team that it's not even possible to truly develop or manage their performance, then it's more of like an org chart issue. Like, we need to make an adjustment to our ratios.
Makes sense. So it's like, did you say 10 is that number where it becomes a little gray?
I think that 10 or 15. Again, it's going to vary from your context, your situation. But let's say, yeah, some reasonable number where if you have like 25 people that are your direct reports, it's like, well, how could I even physically keep track of all of you?
Yeah. That's interesting. Cool. Well, we're getting pretty close to the 30-minute mark. So any wise words or any final takeaways before we set you free?
No, I think we hit it right there. And like I said, maybe that's it, is in terms of development, so many small business owners, executives, all this group is like the classic phrase, right? You spend so much time working in the business that you don't step back and work on the business. But this is just an invitation to think about developing your people and your team and intentionally developing the culture of your organization. Those are kind of like the 80-20 rule, right? Like those have no end to kind of how much they can amplify your business, right? If you get one more 15-minute Zoom meeting done or you send 2 more emails that day, that's great. But actually carving out some organizational development time and people development time into your sort of operational tempo, let's say 15% of your time, that's going to go a really long way as you grow.
Love that. Cool. Thanks for jumping on, guys. Appreciate the time. Jackson crushed it as always. You're a good speaker, man. Super impressive.